All right, we'll go ahead and start talking about consoles a little bit. First thing we need to talk about with any console that you come in contact with, there's always signal flow. So your basic signal flow is going to be anything that goes from your input to your output. How it gets through the board, there's various processes that it has to go through in order to get to your output from the board to the PA system. So the actual way that it goes through your board will vary depending on what board you're using, what manufacturer, what tools are available. Sometimes you can actually alter where the compressor goes on a digital soundboard. There's other things called side chaining effects, which we'll get into a little bit here in just a minute. But yeah, so basically input to output, that's what signal flow is and how it gets from start to finish. So this is a really cool little slide that I found. It's actually the end of a video that someone just screen grabbed, which is really cool. But this is what signal flow might look like. Now that is a little confusing to start with. So if y'all don't care, I'm going to draw it. Okay?
Like modern art.
Yeah. So basically you're going to start off with your input, which this is just an XLR input right here. It might be a face. Who knows? I'm not an artiste. So basically you have an input and it comes into something here that's usually a little triangle. That's your preamp. That's where your gain is. So this is your gain. So this is where you control the amplitude. So this, as soon as it comes into the board, you're controlling how much amplitude you have. And the reason why this is important, because signal strength going through the rest of the signal process is, if you have a good signal strength, you can do a whole lot more with the rest of the stuff, which is why I say you want to have a decent amount of gain. You don't have to have a whole lot, but a decent amount of gain. Especially when we start talking about the old analog boards, if you don't have enough gain, it doesn't sound as good because it's all voltage based. So you want to have enough gain, but not too much gain. So we're going to go from here. Now I'm going to skip over portions of this, just cover the basics for now, and we're going to come back. So here, we're going to come over here to our EQ section, which is sometimes called dynamics, but for the most part, this is your EQ. So this is where you're adjusting your lows, your highs, your mids, so on and so forth. Now, on a lot of boards, you'll have something right here that's called a direct out. So this is DO. So if you have a multi-track system and you want to record it, you just plug up all your direct outs to your multi-track system and you can record individual channels this way. So basically all you're getting is input and the gain. You can also send direct outs to anything else. So if you want to send a direct out to, one speaker in a room so that this one person can be heard no matter where they're at, you can do that too. That's just basically where the direct out comes in. Is
that where the direct out goes to the ears? Or no?
No, that's a little different. The ears, you have a whole lot more options with them. They're called tap points, and you can choose where in this signal flow you can actually send it to the band's in-ears. So from here, you have this little section here. It's called the PFL. If I can actually draw it right. This is your pre-fader level. So once you go from input to gain, EQ, you have what's called pre-fader level. And this is usually where your solo button is on an analog system. But this is everything before the actual fader knob. Okay? So everything before that comes into here. Now from here, you have a lot of choices. For now, we're going to ignore everything and just assume we're going to a set of speakers for the PA system. So from here, you come over to your actual fader, which you can then go up and down with. From there, you go into your main left-right bus, which is also considered your just main outputs. Okay, so I'm just going to draw a single line for this because it's easier. We're just going to call this mains. Okay? So from your mains, comes down here into this, and then this comes down into your speaker system. Okay? So that basically covers the entire top line and the right side.
Right.
Now, the other part you have to think of when you're just dealing with this is you have things that are called inserts. So basically, you could take this signal here, you can cause a break, send it out to some other unit, and then it basically does this round and then back down into here. So you could put an external compressor, an external EQ, a reverb unit, anything you want to into this insert right here. So it's going to go gain, insert, back into the signal flow here, and then along through there. Okay? Now, also in this point here, right before to the direct, or right after the direct out, this is where everything kind of changes on digital boards. This is where you usually find your gate. So your gate will be right here. Usually gate comes before EQ. So anything you do here, you have your gate. Now typically, your compressor will come after your EQ. So this is where your compressor would be. So without assuming any monitor mixes or any other effects or anything like that, this is a typical signal flow for a PA system, input to output. So now what happens if you have monitors or, for example, floor monitors? Well, right here at this PFL, you can actually send it to something that's called your auxiliary mixes, your pre-auxiliary bus, or whatever it's called on this. It's called a pre-aux bus here. Now, they put it way up here. Most of the time, that's not true. Most of the time, your aux buses come back here at this pre-fader volume. So your EQ actually affects your auxiliary.
So you couldn't do the monitors with the DO?
You could, but this is an individual channel.
Okay.
So what this does, you're going to take your PFL and send it to an actual auxiliary bus mix, your group mix. So this is going to be your...
And that's what we're doing.
aux bus. For monitors, sort of. When it gets to digital systems, we have a lot of other choices. But if you're talking about like a floor monitor where you have an actual wedge speaker in front of you, that's what this is.
Okay.
So from there, you can take this auxiliary bus, come down to your actual auxiliary output here. So this is going to be your auxiliary output. And from here, this gets routed down to another set of speakers or floor monitors, whatever the case may be. Okay, so this is an output, and this is an output from your board. So this is your main output for your main speaker system, and this is your auxiliary output for anything like floor monitors or anything that is pre-fader. Now, you also have something here that's called a post-fader bus. So this is going to be post-fade. Now, you can have multiple auxiliary buses, you can have multiple pre-fader or post-fader buses. Remember, a bus is just a collection of channels. It's a mixed bus, it's a group. All are the same thing. Most of the time you'll hear professional people call them as mixed buses. But anyways, so post-fade, you have your post-fade outs here. I'm going to draw them down here. The paper's moving on me. So this is going to be one of your post-fade outputs. So this is going to come down to here. Now this is typically for effects. So anything that say, okay, well, I want reverb, but if I pull the vocal mic out, I don't want the reverb to still be going, right? So usually those are on your post-fade. So whenever you pull the volume out, there's no signal going to the reverb mix, so you don't have anything that goes on here. So then this goes through some sort of hardware or software-based system, does some effects processing on it. I believe they draw it with a bunch of zeros in here or something like that. I'm not sure exactly. But it goes through here, And then from here, it comes out and back to your mains. So typically, on a digital board, this is all internal. You can use an external processor, but there's always like an effects return in on most boards that allow you to do this. That is basically what signal flow is. When you start talking about in-ears, especially with the P16s that we have here, where you have multiple channels, you can choose which channel you're listening to, you have what's called a tap point. So that means you have 4 or 5 different areas where you can actually take this signal and route it to the in-ears. So right now there is one here right after the gain. There's another one right before the EQ. So gain, that's your first choice. Include the gate, second choice. Include your EQ, third choice. Include your compressor, fourth choice. Include what your fader volume is, last choice. So this is input, pre-EQ, post-EQ, pre-fader, post-fader. That's typically what we can do with mixes. So we can change, each of these channels are independently assignable. So we can choose your vocals to be everything except compressor, which is what we do now. We don't send compression to the vocals, but we do send compression to things like kick drum and snare drum. If we wanted to take the EQ out, so you have just a raw mix, such as if you have a really, really good electric guitar amp and you love the way it sounds, but in the room it sounds a little weird, so I have to EQ it for the room, but you don't want to have it EQ'd for your ears, we could send it before the EQ, right? So that's basically the way in-ear monitors work. You can choose where you send it from.
So they do hear what I hear.
Right now, yes. Everything is sent right now after the compressor, before the fader, with the exception of the vocals. The vocals we send with no compression. We used to send compression. Yeah, we used to send compression to the vocals, but yeah, Chelsea convinced me not to.
I knew it was going to come to that.
It's like, why does it sound like every time I start singing, I can't hear myself? Okay, I turn the compressor off. Oh, I can hear myself.
Annoying.
And then something else breaks, and then she usually complains about something else breaking. So
I do not complain that often. I have not.
That is true.
Complaining until Christmas when you messed everything up.
when I messed everything up, huh?
The gate's before EQ, so since they're getting EQ'd, they're also getting the gate.
Yes. If you don't want to include the gate, you have to send it at the input. It's called INC or low cut.
A lot of work for us.
Yeah, that means everything's really hot. So on the kick drum, you're going to be picking up the entire drum kit through the kick drum mic. Yeah, gates, usually we only put gates on drums. Every once in a while I'll put a gate on something else, but not typically. But that's a stylistic choice. So, questions on signal flow. This is about as basic as it gets, which is still fairly complicated looking at it. Okay? All right. So here are some of the basic components you can find on every soundboard out there. You have inputs and outputs. Inputs are usually microphone inputs, which are XLRs, which is the 3 pins, which is what the little smiley face looks like. Or you have just single 1/4-inch jacks. Those are typically your only 2 inputs you have. Outputs, if you're talking about analog boards, most of the time they're 1/4-inch outputs. If you have a large enough board and if you spend enough money on it, sometimes you'll have XLR outputs. But basically, those are your 2 types of inputs and outputs. Each channel on the board, each input on the board will have its own channel strip, which will have gain, EQ, auxiliary sends, pan, and fader on it. Those you'll typically find on every soundboard you have, regardless of how big it is. Some soundboards have grouping on it, some soundboards don't. Again, depends on how big the board is, how much money you spend on it. On this analog board, there are 4 subgroups here that you can use. And the way that this one works is that you assign the subgroups using your pan knob. So you can choose 1 and 2, left is 1, 2 is right. So if you want to use grouping, you can. In most situations, The only time I use grouping is for like the drums, or if I'm sending a particular mix separate from the house mix to something else.
So is that not the DCAs then?
This is not DCAs. They're on an analog board. They're called VCAs, voltage controlled amplifiers. It's the same exact thing. You're just controlling how much voltage the fader has. So those are there. They're not very common unless you have a really big, huge, like 50-plus channel board. They are there, but they're just not very common. So again, may or may not have grouping channels. Every soundboard will have a master output, whether it be 1 or 2 or even 3. So you'll have a main mono output almost always, or you'll have a left-to-right output for your stereo. Most of the time, it's going to be 1. And most of the time, even if you had 2, it's all the mono output is dependent on your stereo output anyway. Here we have a left-right master fader here, but it controls our main mono output. It doesn't control, I mean, it can control the left-right bus, but it controls our mono output as well. And every soundboard usually has auxiliary outputs for your floor monitors and things like that. So those are just your basics. Now here is a fader, and you can kind of see it up there. Whenever we get this video done and I get back and you can see the slide a little bit better, you'll notice towards the bottom, those lines get really close together, okay? So since you can't see it, if this is a blown up picture of it, this right here is typically where your 0 is. This is 0 decibels by the time it gets to the fader. So when the signal comes in from everything else, right here's the volume of it. So the fader is actually meant to trim volume, not give volume, right? You can go up to usually about positive 10 in case you need to give it a little more volume, but typically 0 and below is where faders are designed to work. They're designed to trim volume away from your main output. So you get your gain set, you got EQ set, everything, but it's just a little bit louder than everything else in the band, so you want to bring it down. Now, the thing about this, reason why DCAs are so good, is because this is -5. This may be -10, so the distance from here to here and here to here about the same. But your next one usually is about right here, and that's -20. So 5, 10. And the gap between 10 and 20 is smaller than the gap between 5 and 10 on your fader. Then you come down here, you usually have some other little hash marks, but you'll get to like -30, which is even closer than 20 was to 10. Then you'll have -40 right underneath it, right here. And then next you'll have -60. So as you can see, the lower you get, the tighter those numbers get together. Then eventually you get to what's called -infinity, which is off. So that's the way a fader is designed to work. So again, scale is not constant, which is why if you have a fader here and you have a fader here and you have on a DCA and you want to raise the entire thing by like 2 decibels, you can do it with a DCA. Trying to go from 40 to -38, that's almost impossible. I mean, it can be done, but anything you do down here is going to be very dramatic. It's going to be a very big change. Whereas if you're up here, it's going to be a very small change by the same distance. Okay? That's the way faders work. So again, a DCA is a digital controlled amplifier, otherwise known as a voltage controlled amplifier on an analog board. Remote control the volume of this fader value. Okay? That's basically all it's there for. You can't put any EQ on it, you can't put any effects on it, you can't send it anywhere. It's just controlling the volume of those faders. Now, what you can do is if you have a subgroup or what's called a mixed bus, you can apply effects to those. You're basically taking all those channels, and instead of controlling the fader values, you're taking all those channels and sending them as a single channel. So you're basically creating, from 8 channels, you're creating 1 channel, right? That's where groups come in. So from the group, you can change the value of that group that doesn't affect the fader value of the channels. And then you can do effects on it. You can EQ it, whatever you need to. The best example of this is how we do drums here. We have 7 inputs assigned to drums right now. We would have 8 if I had another kick microphone, but I don't. So what we do is we have the kick drum and the snare drum independent from the rest of the drum mix. And then everything after that we grouped into a single drum mix. So when I change the value of the drum mix volume, that affects what the band hears, but it doesn't necessarily affect what the house hears, right? So we can do that so that way we can do little tricks here and there to say the band in their ears can hear the drums at a specific volume, and then I can use a group attached to a DCA to control the overall house mix. So it kind of gets a little complicated there, but it all works out in the end.
No, it's out.
So it's like if one of your singers says, I need to hear less drums, you can turn drums down on them, but to the house, it's no different.
Right. Well, they have the P16s here, which are out at Mount Carmel as well. So they can control that from those boxes. That is completely separate from anything that I can do on the board. The only thing I can control for them there is EQ, gates, and
And
compression.
right there, those little boxes.
Yeah, one of the boxes sit on the floor there is a P16. It's basically it's a personal mixer. And this is going to be, I'll have a little slide on that later, but it's basically, you have 16 channels on it, and you can choose which channel you're looking at. You can change the volume of it. You can change whether it's panned to your left ear or your right ear. It's actually pretty cool.
So that's working off your monitor.
Yeah.
Personal
Yeah.
monitor, okay.
Those are personal monitors for the band, yeah. Okay, questions on
Those
subgroups?
don't affect the main monitor?
No.
Okay, just personal, okay, I got you.
Basically, whatever I send to those is completely separate from anything I use.
So that's usually a DO.
Yeah, it's a tap point somewhere out of the signal flow,
Okay.
depending on where the tap point is, with compressor, without compressor.
Okay.
But it's basically a direct signal to them. And then those are basically just small mixers is all they are.
Okay.
So they have 16 inputs, and then you can mix it off of there.
But you're listening to the compressed.
You can be, yes.
Okay.
Again, I can control.
But you could tap it anywhere along the
Yeah,
way.
I can control what is included in that input, whether it's just raw volume, EQ, compressor, or any of the above.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what those are for. A matrix. This is basically a group. When you think about subgrouping in mix buses, usually you take a bunch of channels and you mix it down to a single group. What matrix does is you take multiple channels and you mix it down to multiple outputs. So they call it a mixer within a mixer. So you have a matrix that you could say, okay, I want one feed with this particular volume and this particular settings going over here, but I'm going to take the same feed and I'm going to send it over here using different settings. So where you might see this commonly is for a lobby mix, which we don't have one. That's one of the things that we want to do. We want to have a lobby mix so that if you're standing out in the lobby, you can hear whoever's preaching preach. We also want to feed it into the bathrooms. So if somebody gets up and walks away from the service, they don't miss anything. Also for cry rooms, anything like that. So that's basically what matrices are used for, is to take your single output, your main volume, whatever you've mixed, and send it to multiple sources. That's what a matrix does. You can also do what's called front or side fills. So if you're in a big, huge room, a lot of times your PA is really high up, which is great for people who are way far back in the room. But if you're sitting on the front row, that PA hanging way up in the ceiling doesn't do a whole lot for you. So what they have is they have a series of speakers along the front that only have certain things in the mix. So they won't have like kick drum or bass in them, but they'll have the vocal mics so you can hear what the vocals are saying, because the subs are generally on the floor. So they'll hear those. So you can do things like that with fills, and how you do that is through matrices. Okay. All right. So now we're going to talk a little bit about analog versus digital, and here's a couple pictures of them, but you also have them right in front of you. This is a Mackie board. We tend to have a lot of Mackies around here. This is my personal one, but most of the other boards around here are Mackies as well. I think the one out at Mount Carmel is like a Soundcraft, but they're all basically the same. So basically what I want to do is, if you look at the way you can tell what an analog board is, you have all these knobs up here. That's just a giveaway. Now, the reason why you have all these knobs here is because these knobs only control this channel. Okay? So, again, this is voltage controlled. So you have a single circuit from your input to your output. So you have to have everything kind of in a uniform line for your circuitry to work right. So in most cases, you have your gain, again, using proper signal flow. It's supposed to go gain, EQ, auxiliary outputs, master output.
And there's an XLR input on the back for each one of them.
Yes. Well, most of them have XLR. Some of them have just quarter inches. Some of them have RCA inputs. It depends. But most of the time, it's XLR. Now, where Mackie is weird is that they put their auxiliaries at the top of their circuitry. So with a Mackie board, you actually get your modern mixes before you get your EQ, which I hate. But that's just the way that they designed the circuitry on this particular board. So this is what a typical analog board would look like. This is what a digital board will most commonly look like. And these come in various shapes and sizes. But basically, you have select buttons where you select which channel you want to look at. And then from here, all these knobs up here change according to what channel you selected. So instead of being voltage throughout the entire board, it's all digital ones and zeros. So whichever button you selected, it knows what channel you're looking at, and it changes all of these to be whatever those settings are. The cool thing about digital boards is that you can remap anything to anywhere. So you could take input 1, but you can have it coming through on channel 14 if you wanted it to, which makes it really good. So that way, if you want to have all your channels organized the same way, you don't have to make sure they're plugged up on the stage the exact same way. Especially here when we have 16 channels on one side of the stage and 16 channels on the other side of the stage, and if you move the drum kit from one side to the other, you don't have to repatch it here. You just have to say, okay, well, channel 1's now going to be channel 17. Right? So then you can plug it up to channel 17 over here and still channel 1 on your board. Okay? So that's basically the main visible difference. We've already talked about this, but a digital board will use a common set of controls to control everything, common channel strip. So the one thing that I have on here that is very different is your level meter. So on the board here, here's where the level meter is on this board. Over here, it's right here. And they're different colors for different reasons. On an analog board, distortion is not always a bad thing. It's not preferred, but you can actually get some pretty cool effects with it. The only downside to that is that there's mixed reviews, whether you listen to this one side of the coin or the other side of the coin. You can fry your circuitry on an analog board. I've seen it happen, so I tend to agree with them on that distortion is very bad for an analog board. With a digital board, if you clip the channel, you're not going to fry anything. It's just going to sound terrible. It's going to sound worse clipping here than it would if you clipped it here. Because it's zeros and ones you can't really distort very well without making it sound terrible. Whereas if you distort it here, it's going to sound more natural if you clip it. So the other main difference is that your zero on an analog board is typically where your best gain structure is. It's not your clip value. On a digital board, 0 is your clip value, and then you have everything underneath that is negative 15, I think, is about average for what would normally be considered 0 on an analog board. Okay? That's all I have on the differences between the two right now. We're going to talk about some basic equipment that you might see, and then we're going to talk about mixing and doing some actual examples.